Hi guys, welcome to Little Wicket Railway. I'm Rob, and in this video we're going to be fitting this LGB Stainz locomotive with DCC sound. I wasn't planning on filming this, I was just going to do it and assumed it would be really easy because bigger models generally mean more space and fewer fiddly parts. But after starting, it turned out to be really difficult. So before I got too far in, I reassembled the model so that I could film the install from the beginning should someone find that useful. Some of the newer versions of these Stainz locos are DCC ready and have a socket available for a decoder to be installed, but this is an early version from the mid-80s and it's definitely not DCC ready. When this was put together, I don't think they expected many people to take them apart. A few parts are glued in and it's very easy to break them when disassembling, and you basically have to disassemble the whole model to do the install. Also, I don't like modifying models when I do DCC installs, but in this case there's no way around it. You do have to cut into the model to route wires, but not in a way that's visible from the outside. And apologies in advance, I've tried to tidy it up in the edit, but this install was really quite messy, and with all the head scratching took about 4 hours. This was my first time taking apart an LGB model. I couldn't find any guide to how to disassemble it, so I was pretty much working blind and figuring it out for myself. There's loads of screws to keep track of, quite a bit of rewiring because it's got front and rear lighting, and a big change to how the motor gets its power. So you've been warned, this is not an install for the faint-hearted, but let's get started. So here's the model, and the first thing we're going to do is unscrew the funnel, which is basically just a big bolt that passes all the way through to underneath the model and connects to a nut which is under there and it's just dropped off. So that can just slide out. Be careful of the bulb because it comes off with the lamp housing as well. And we can just secure the bolt back onto the bottom there so we don't lose it. Then that allows you to remove the front coupling, which slides out. And then it's a case of removing loads of screws. So the rear coupling is basically a plate that is attached to the underside of the loco using 2 screws. So if you remove those, the whole thing comes out as a single piece. And as I say, there are going to be a lot of screws, so it might be worth either labeling them up or just keeping track of them like I am in the video, so you know where everything goes back. There are another couple of screws halfway down the locomotive that go up through the red chassis into these little black plastic parts. One on either side, and the black plastic bits should just drop off if you turn the locomotive upside down. That white stuff's just a bit of polystyrene that's come out of the box. And it's useful if you've got a long thin screwdriver or an extension like I'm using, because you've got to slide it between all the connecting rods of the motion to be able to get to the screw. And some of these screws fall into awkward positions, so it's always good to have a pair of tweezers on hand to retrieve them. Next up, there is a single screw on the right hand side of the loco just beneath the cab that needs to come out. Not one on the other side for this. And then you've got these little black plastic clips on either side that need to come out. And you don't need to remove these. I didn't realise that at the time, but there's steps on either side beneath the cab, and you can remove those if you want. It's one less thing that could get damaged whilst you're working on the model, but you don't have to remove them, I don't think, if you don't want to. On the rear, you've got 2 screws at the bottom of the cab area. These need to come out. And then we've got this rear cow catcher thing, I guess, and that needs to come off too. Then we should be able to remove the motor block from the red chassis just by easing it out. It's a snug fit, but it should come out with a bit of persuasion. And there we go. And then there's one more screw underneath here that you can see that red bit of plastic's cracked on mine, but that needs to come out as well. And then these 2 screws actually make the connection between the lighting circuitry and the motor block and the pickups. And it was at this point I was thinking to myself, how am I going to rewire this model? Because obviously we need to run wires from the pickups, which are in the motor block, up to the decoder, which I planned on keeping in the boiler area. And then we also needed to run wires back down to the motor. And at the moment, I only had one way of doing that via these contacts. So I knew I was going to have to think up a different way of doing it and maybe drill some holes and route the wires, but I'll show you what I did later. I decided to remove these screws with the wires because we're going to completely redo all the wiring for the lighting anyway. And I ended up not relying on these screw contacts because I found them to be a little bit unreliable, especially when I put more wires in. There was a chance I wasn't going to get a full connection, so I actually soldered the wires on. Then the cab comes off. Be careful when removing the cab because the driver is just glued in and his arm does catch on the window. And this is the huge weight that is inside the boiler that just slides out. Then it was time to take the motor block apart. So there are 4 screws that are visible, 2 above the wheels, and then there are 2 at either end, which kind of hold the end bits on. Then you need to remove the wheels on this side so you can at least get half of the motor block off. There's just screws into the axles. Be careful when you're doing these though, because there are carbon brushes and springs behind each of the wheels, and as you see, I didn't realise this, so they just drop out there. So that's one of the carbon brushes that's fallen out, and there you can just see the spring poking out. So best to remove those and keep them safe, because they do have a habit of pinging off into the distance if you're not careful. Then the wheels should just slide off the axles. Just need to be a bit careful here that you're not bending any of the connecting rods. Then hidden behind the wheels there are another couple of screws that need to come out. These are the final screws that are holding the 2 sides of the motor block together. You don't need to touch the screws that are connected to the skid pickups in the middle. And then the motor block just comes apart in 2, and there you can see we've got the big chunky motor here. So let's just pause it here and take a look at what we've got. So this is a single piece of metal which at either end has 2 contacts for the carbon brushes. In the middle, behind the motor, you can't see it, is another piece that connects to the skid pickup. And then here and here you've got bits that are designed to make contact with the motor terminals, and only one end is in use. So the one on the left hand side of the screen is not being used, but the one on the right hand side is actually touching the motor terminals, and that's how the motor gets power directly from the pickups. So that's the first problem that we've encountered, is that we can't have this set up if we're going to use DCC, because the power from the rails needs to go to the decoder first before it goes back to the motor. So whilst I was thinking about what to do about that, I decided to remove these 2 wires which aren't necessary at the rear of the cab. Presumably they're used as a little socket where you can plug something in for coach lighting maybe, but I'm not going to be using them, and the fewer wires the better. So I just desoldered those and they came out nice and easily. Then tucked up in the cab you've also got this board with diodes, which is used for the directional lighting, and we're not going to be using that. The directional stuff's all taken care of in the decoder, so that can come off as well. Then we've got the wires that lead from the cab through the boiler to the front light, and I just wanted to remove those. We're going to do a bit of rewiring anyway, so if we take those out, then the boiler is completely separate from the cab. They just pass through this kind of firebox plate that sits in the cab, which kind of routes the wires in a interesting way from behind the plate through the face of it. So that's the plate completely separate now, and it's this area that we're going to modify to be able to route the wires up from the motor block. To isolate this pickup strip from directly contacting with the motor, I used a bit of Kapton tape, just wrapping it round. The alternative is snapping this pickup off, but if anyone did ever want to convert this back to analog, if you snapped it off, that's it, there's no going back. So I thought the easiest thing to do, and it's going to be fairly reliable, would just be to insulate this with a bit of tape, and then once it was insulated you just have to bend it back into place. And then you need to do exactly the same thing on the other side, so that involves taking the motor out. And then you can see I've bent the tab up here, ready to wrap it in some more Kapton tape. So that's both sides of the motor connection isolated. Now is a good time to give all your gears a good clean whilst you've got access to them, and re-lubricate everything. My gears are actually quite well lubricated already, so I didn't have to do very much here. And then again, just bend it back into position and just make sure that none of that tape is going to interfere with the gears. Then I needed to connect some wires to the motor terminals, so I started by tinning those. And then just connecting up some wires. And really the wires here should be orange and grey, but I didn't have any orange and grey wire, so I'm using black and red wire. And apologies, I know I've connected the red wire to the black side of the motor and the black wire to the red side of the motor, but I didn't realise at the time. You're going to need a couple of holes so you can feed the wires up through the motor block into the cab and the boiler area to connect with the decoder. And if you watch where I've drilled these, it's pretty important. It's just behind one of the screw holes and to the left of the copper strip, one on either side. Pause the video and take a look. The placement of these holes is pretty important if you want the wires to come out in the right place to feed up through into the boiler. Then it's just a case of feeding these wires up through and getting the motor back into place, making sure the wires aren't going to interfere with anything inside the motor housing. Once the wires are through, you can put the motor housing back together. I actually found it easier if you did the front and rear sections of the motor housing first and then the central section, and it's just those 6 screws, and then you can put the wheels back on. And then don't forget to put the carbon brushes and springs back in. If you hold those in place with your finger whilst you slot the wheel back on, then they'll stay in place. You'll need to be careful as well that the quartering on the wheels, so they should be 90 degrees out of phase with the opposite side. And then you can screw the axle screws back on and then refit the cylinders. Just make sure that the metal rods feed into the holes in the cylinders. Once that's back into position, you can screw it back on from underneath. So that's the motor block reassembled. We've now got our wires coming out that give us the direct feed to the motor, and we've still got our copper tabs available to connect to the pickups. And now is a good time just to double check that your feed into the motor is working. So if you connect it up to an analog controller, give it some power and make sure that the wheels turn and that you've connected up everything correctly. Before I started this process, I checked what the stall current was of the locomotive by connecting it up to an analog controller with my multimeter, setting it on the current measurement, and then just holding the locomotive in place when I turn the controller up. And as you can see, when the motor's being stalled, it's almost drawing a full amp of current. So this means you need to choose a decoder which is capable of handling that, and these Econami Eco-200s are able to deal with a stall current of 2 amps, and it should be more than capable of handling the demands of this locomotive. I wanted to put the decoder and the speaker that I'm using inside the boiler, and I was a bit worried because the weight's metal, so the first thing I did was to insulate it using black tape. So as you can see, plenty of room in there for the decoder and speaker. The next step was to solder the 2 purple wires from the decoder onto the speaker. I'm using an iPhone speaker, it should be loud enough. The next thing to do was to solder the black wire from the front light onto the white wire from the decoder. So this is the front light function. And I don't think the bulbs have polarity, so it doesn't really matter, but because the white wire is a negative and the black presumably is negative on the bulb, that's the combination I've gone with. And then the red wire will connect to the blue common positive when we get to that stage, but there's still some more work to be done first. Every time I do one of these solder joins, I'm covering it with a bit of heat shrink just to protect the join. You need to remove this section in the middle of the firebox door bit of plastic, and this will allow the wires to be routed through from underneath. So I just cut it out with a small saw and then filed it down, which has given us plenty of room now. My original plan was to use these screws as the pickup connection again, but I found them unreliable after I did my first reassemble, so I ended up doing away with these and just soldering the pickup wires directly onto the motor block tabs. And then we've got these two wires that connect to the rear light on the cab. They're different lengths, so the first thing I did was make them the same length, but they're still too short to run the length under the cab to the decoder area, so I needed to extend them. So I've used some blue and yellow wire just to extend those, with the blue connected to the red wire and the yellow connected to the black. So those yellow and blue wires then feed through a hole that was already there in the bottom of the cab floor. They'll go underneath the cab and reappear through that gap that we've just cut in the firebox door area, and all the wires are going to feed up there. So we've got the two pickup wires, we've got the two motor wires, and then we've got the yellow and blue extensions from the rear light. Routing all these wires can be a bit fiddly, but take your time, it is possible. Ideally they would all be passing through that gap, because that is the gap that allows it to pass into the boiler. Then we can connect the yellow extension wire onto the yellow wire of the decoder. We can solder the blue wire from the rear light onto the blue wire of the decoder, and then both of those wires onto the red wire of the front light, because these are all a common positive connection. So we've got three wires soldered together there, both terminals from the lighting, one at the front and one at the back, and the blue common positive from the decoder. Then we've got the pickup wires here. So I made the wires really long so I had stuff to work with, but they didn't need to be that long, so I shortened them down and then connected one to the red wire on the decoder and one to the black wire on the decoder. So those are our pickup wires connected to the decoder. Next up, we've got the motor wires, so one goes to the orange wire on the decoder, and one goes to the grey wire on the decoder. So that's our motor wires connected up. And now, just to protect these speaker terminals, because they're quite exposed and I don't want them shorting out on anything, I've got my Bosch gluey gun here, and I'm just going to cover the terminals in a bit of hot glue. And that should hopefully prevent them from making contact with anything. So here's an overview of all the wiring, and I told you at the start it was going to be messy, and as you can see it really is. There's wires everywhere at the moment, so we need to get these all tidied up. So I trimmed off the ones I wasn't using from the decoder and then started wrapping tape around the wires to just keep them all neat and tidy. There'll be plenty of space inside the boiler for us to throw some wires in. When you put the weight back into the boiler, you need to turn it to the side so that it will fit in neatly and doesn't trap any wires. And now's a good time to check that your decoder wiring is all working. So you can hear that the speaker's working. You can see that the directional lighting is working there at the back. But I had a problem with the front lighting. It turns out it was just that the bulb wasn't screwed in fully, so that was an easy fix. And as you can see, the functions are working nicely. And I decided stupidly to try the motor, and it does work, but maybe don't try it whilst you're balancing the cab on it. Then it was a case of doing a bit more tidying up. And then reassembling the model, basically doing the disassembly in reverse. So starting with that screw underneath the cab and then refitting the motor block. And now is a good time to put the model on a piece of track that's connected to a DCC supply and check that everything's working. So as you can see here, it is. And as you can see, the front light now works because I've screwed the bulb in. So we can finish off reassembling the model now. The funnel goes in and passes through. The front cow catcher thing goes on. Then that nut goes back into place and the funnel gets screwed into it. Again, be careful when fitting the front light housing over the lamp. Those bulbs do get quite hot also, just to let you know. So it might be worth considering replacing those with LEDs in the future. If you do that though, these are bulbs that can take 12 volts. If you were to replace them with LEDs, don't forget you need to put some resistors in as well. At the back, you've got those two screws that screw into the cab housing. Then you've got the rear coupling plate with the two screws on either side. Again, be careful here, it's really easy to break that plastic spring that recenters the coupling. And then you just fit the rest of the parts. It's pretty straightforward, and you can give it all a test. So as you can see, it's all working. And when watching this back, I realised I'd fitted the cab steps on back to front, so that's something I changed later on. So I think it's plenty loud enough. It probably could be a little bit louder maybe, given that these are probably going to be running outdoors on most people's layout, but my layout's indoors, so it doesn't need to be super loud. All the lighting's working, functions are working, so I'm pretty happy with that. So there we are, installation of DCC sound into an early LGB Stainz No.2 Locomotive. Not the easiest install ever, but I'm happy with how it turned out. Definitely worth the effort, and it's great to see such an iconic G-scale model running on the Malvern Sills Railway. I hope that someone out there finds this video useful. Even if you're not doing a DCC conversion, it might still be helpful if you want to know how to access the motor block and gears for servicing. If you did find it useful, then please give the video a like, and why not subscribe to the channel? There's plenty more content on there, and it's not exclusively G-gauge, there's a variety of railway related videos. I've also got a second channel called LWR2 for all the clips that don't quite fit with the main channel, so do please visit there, the link will be in the description. Special thanks to the YouTube members and patrons for supporting the channel. Your names are up on the screen now, and I really do appreciate it. That's about it for this video, but I'll leave you with some more shots from the running session. Thanks for watching, and I'll hopefully see you again soon.